screen, please. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that it's a great pleasure to be back in Sri Lanka again. Ayubowan, Wanakam, and good morning. I first came here at the request of the United Nations to work with the government, and my second invitation from Lieutenant General Ratnayaka is a deep honor for me to speak at this particular seminar. Commander of the Navy, Commander of the Air Force, Excellencies, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, I first came here in 2010, and worked until January of this year, 2013, supporting the government's initiative in the reintegration of the XLTTE. So it was a period of 3 years, and a very enjoyable and challenging one it was, and I must say that it is a delight to be back. One small area of concern for me is when I was first invited, General, I noticed that you wanted me to speak for 30 minutes. I calculated that as being 28 minutes longer than my wedding speech. So I was a little perturbed, but I'm sure it'll go reasonably well. And I'd like to start with a promise, if I may. And the promise is very clear. I love this country. I think it's a country of great talent and great potential. And as I mentioned to Honourable Secretary of Defence and Urban Development the other day, if there's some way on the short term that I can support this country in its reconciliation efforts as an independent consultant, I will do it pro bono, without cost. Now, in raising some examples from Africa and Asia and my experiences with the United Nations family over 12 years in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction and development, I'd like to apologize to the people who are from the countries which I may mention here if I perhaps get one or two facts out of line. But basically my aim is to raise a few examples of grassroots peace building and some of the initiatives used in the countries where I worked in Africa and Asia, and to see if perhaps there are one or two examples that may be able to be transferred to the Sri Lankan context. So basically the form of the presentation will be along the following lines. I haven't included some of the countries that I've worked in there, most notably Rwanda and very briefly Burundi, as well as some of the West African countries neighboring Liberia. But essentially we will conclude with some lessons and then a wish. First of all, some teachings, however. And a great deal of wisdom in Asia, Africa, and other teachings, and I'd like to start with the Buddha. Our thoughts are very important in terms of what we do and who we are. The United Nations also, in this particular point, shows a great deal of wisdom in the minds of men. That is our minds. That is where peace begins. Hindu religion, compassion above all things, compassion. Christianity, peace-loving, pure, full of mercy. Islam, I particularly like this one. Who is the greatest of thy servants? When you're in a position of power, the one who forgives. And I must say, in Sri Lanka's case, it is the only country, post-conflict country, that I have worked in where there has been a clear military victory. Now this is something when I address, and please excuse my uniform, I was a naval officer once upon a time, but I'm looking a little bit out of place today. This can be an advantage and a disadvantage. And in winning the peace, General, with the greatest of respect, it will make your journey longer, and it will make your journey more complex. And concluding with the Buddha again. So we can see from those various teachings from the religious side that essentially nobody is preaching on any particular religious side or ethnic side anything but love. A great peace builder, Mahatma Gandhi, Anwar Sadat, from the northern African part of the continent, and he said this in front of the Israeli parliament, which took a lot of bravery, to actually say that it doesn't matter who dies in conflict, they belong to us. and a great man, a marvelous man, who has done so much. And it's dealing with your mind, your feelings, and change. And we all change as we evolve, we get older. As we build peace in Sri Lanka, it's a question of change, and that starts with the individual. So I'd like to touch firstly on the Democratic Republic of Congo. I first went there at the end of my naval career as a commander in the Royal Navy, as a military advisor to the force commander at the beginning of the mission, when there were 25 people there. And so it started off, and now it numbers, I think, over 18,000 in the Congo, the UN mission. And after I retired from the Navy, I was asked to serve as a civilian program manager in the Congo again, in the East, dealing specifically with the disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, DDR, of foreign armed combatants and also, latterly, Congolese pro-government militia. And I returned for a third time with the United Nations again, heading the Rapid Response Mechanism, again for DDR mop-up and also to start the SSR process. And a few interesting examples came out of the Congo. First and foremost, a grassroots DDR methodology. When I first went there, there was no protection force in the East, and there was no money, and it was rather myself, 2 assistants, and 1 car. And that was in Goma, which has since become a very hotbed of violence. And so I used 300 local volunteers, and I paid them a minimum of money that I could possibly get out of the UN coffers. And they actually brought back 4,500 people from places in the bush which you and I just can't go. And for those people who have served in MONUC, they will know how vast and dense that northeastern part of the country is. And so as a consequence, it was the local solution run by local African people who wanted to basically support the repatriation of these people that over a period of 2.5 years put back best part of 5,000 people. Similarly, over a period of 18 months, my team maintained contact with the Mai Mai leaders, the pro-government militia in the bush, that basically came and joined the National Army eventually, which was a remarkable thing and something that my small team should be very proud of. And finally, when I went back in 2006, I started the SSR and police capacity building. It's a beautiful country, the Congo. Vast, huge country, and absolutely marvelous scenery, with problems. And here's a little bit of its history, just to sort of see from the Sri Lankan point whether there are some parallels and something to be learned from the troubled history, sometimes, of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Independence, and I've underlined a few key points here, was in 1960. And basically, during a period of approximately 30 years, there was one person in charge. Finally, troops came in from the east with Laurent Kabila, backed by Rwanda, and he took power. He then asked the people who'd backed him to leave the country, and they refused. And as a consequence, basically, it plunged it into a regional war. There were pro-government countries that came into the country and anti-government. And essentially, it got partitioned into north, east, and the capital area into 3 pieces. The Lusaka Accord came along in 1999, just before I arrived, August 1999, and that was the start of the UN mission. And the important thing is that civil society were heavily involved in this. However, violence persisted in many parts of the country, and Kabila was assassinated for not, it is believed, by one of his guards for not particularly seizing the opportunity for brokering long-term peace. His son replaced him, and then the inter-Congolese dialogue, using civil society, armed opposition government, failed at first, but moved on to Sun City in South Africa. And it actually came up with 34 governance resolutions. It was a very inclusive group, and basically led to peace accords between the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, the 3 main bodies that had partitioned the country. The final act approved all of the ICD work, and eventually there was a transitional government before the first multi-party elections in 2006, Now that's 46 years after independence. Immediately after the results were announced, there was war in Kinshasa, and basically after that a new election, and Kabila Jr., Joseph Kabila, became president. However, fighting in the east and the north did continue, particularly in the east, and new groups emerged, CNDP, M23. However, by February 2013, this year, the UN managed to broker a security and cooperation framework, and that was signed by 11 different neighboring nations. Very importantly, a regional perspective on seeking peace within the DRC. However, fighting does continue, and I'm afraid even until last month, the city where I was the head of office, Goma, was shelled again by M23 and potentially by Rwanda, hence the asterisk there, because that's not yet been proven. So the present situation in the DRC, after such a troubled and bumpy 46 years post-independence, continues to be resolved by violence and tension in the east. So a few lessons from the DRC. 362 people took part in the inter-Congolese dialogue. It's very inclusive, but 66 represented the civil society. Now that's not bad, that's a sixth. Just civil society, not political, not military leaders, civil society. It had 5 commissions, and you'll see the numbers in brackets after the 5 commissions on the third point there. And the numbers represent the amount of civil society involvement, people, in each of the commissions. And the last one, 19, in the Peace and National Reconciliation Commission, is a point that I think can be drawn from that, is that anything to do with national reconciliation is going to involve the people. It is not going to be decisions taken from the top downwards. It's going to be consultative from the bottom upwards. And whilst Congo does still experience violence, indeed that is a statistic to be looked at and to be respected. And the civil society were very clever. With absolutely no resources, they went into all of the rural areas, particularly in the east and north of Congo, and they asked people, what do you want us to do for you at the inter-Congolese dialogue? And so they basically mobilized opinions. They said to people, you have a voice. It is absolutely paramount, and that was all parts of society. You have a voice, and we can represent your voice for you. And so they basically harmonized the agendas of people and presented society's goals for the west and east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. What do we want as the people to make sure that their voice was heard? That's a peace-building initiative from the grassroots upwards. So the civil society role was absolutely paramount in the inter-Congolese dialogue. It was an example of direct involvement in a top-level political process, and MONUC, in parallel, established a committee of wise elders. These would be traditional leaders from the communities whose power perhaps had been eroded by centralized democracy and by the elections process. And so these people were used at some degree to broker decision-making and to also chair meetings that could be at times a bit combative. Very fortunate in the Democratic Republic of Congo in that the one UN approach, which is a cliche that's currently amongst UN circles about how we deal with post-conflict, we don't deal with it agency by agency, we deal with it together. It did work in Congo. It had a bumpy start, but it did actually proceed quite well. And indeed, a holistic regional accord signed by 11 nations brokered by the UN showed that a regional approach is the only solution to large conflicts such as the DRC. Moving on to Liberia, and it's very nice to see General Akbar from Bangladesh in the room as well, because he worked very closely with us in Liberia. When I was the head of DDR, he was one of the sector commanders and did an absolutely fabulous job. An inclusive approach was taken. It had had 15 years of civil war, basically, and pretty much every family was touched by the conflict. And so 105,000 people were disarmed and demobilized. Many were repatriated to other countries who were foreign armed combatants, not mercenaries. Mercenaries are excluded from these programs, but foreign armed combatants who'd got sucked in from places like Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and so forth, were also repatriated and reintegrated at home. And for the first time, and I lobbied very hard for this, and this is something that I was very pleased actually happened in the end. DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, actually included unarmed women and children for the first time in UN history. And this was absolutely fundamental, because if you imagine in a combat force where a woman's role or a child's role may be various, and indeed at the end of the fighting, if you only have a certain number of guns, say a third of the people are actually armed, if you only disarm and you only reintegrate those people who present with weapons, it leaves 2/3 disenfranchised, undemobilized, and potentially with a mindset that hasn't changed after the conflict. So this was something that we saw as inclusive, and we managed to get approval from New York, and it's something, again, that my small but very hard-working team there should be rightly proud of. Following that, because the proliferation of cheap weapons was so widespread in Liberia, we followed it up by community arms collection programs. And these were incentive-based community programs where we could go in and we could ensure that anybody who'd kept arms beyond the amnesty, beyond the deadline for handing them in, could be dealt with in a way that was not going to be inflammatory. And the SSR program was started with police training, although SSR in Liberia still requires to be moved forward at this time. Again, a beautiful country, marvelous place, Liberia, fabulous people, with its problems. A little bit of its history. Independence a long time ago, established by freed slaves, African-American slaves, who actually established a colony in West Africa, and essentially, again, suffered from dictatorships during its period during the 1900s. The Abuja Accord was signed, and Charles Taylor was elected in 1996. However, it was a fragile peace, and certain groups emerged that undermined it and also plunged neighboring Sierra Leone into its own civil war. LERD and Model were the two main anti-government forces, and they basically partitioned the country, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, into three pieces. Taylor resigns after the Comprehensive Peace Accord because it was rumored that he was going to have a one-way ticket to The Hague, and some interesting questions, and a national transitional government around Liberia. And that was during the period that I was there. So after declared independence in 1847, the first democratically elected president in Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was elected in 2006. And it's a fragile state, but it enjoys relative peace. And I don't think there were many people with me in 2004-05 in Liberia who would have believed that that peace would have actually been maintained for 11 years up until now. Sorry, 9 years up until now. Some lessons from Liberia. Again, civil society shaped the peace agreement, and they did it in a very creative way there. They ensured the acceptance of the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Accord, by the Liberian people. Public information was very effectively used in Liberia, extremely effectively used. As the head of DDR, during the 8-month program, I was on the radio 6 days out of 7, every morning at 8:15 to say what had happened yesterday, what was going to happen today, and what was going to happen tomorrow, and to be prepared for it, because there had been incidences of significant civil unrest prior to my arrival in the country that the public information really prevented at that particular time. So there was not a shot fired in anger in 8 months during that program when we disarmed and demobilized 105,000 people. The engagement of community-based organizations and non-governmental organizations and women's activists was very, very well done in Liberia. And again, middle-ranking police officers were targeted for leadership training. It wasn't the senior officers who attended training, it was middle-ranking people, and made sure that perhaps that these people would change the Liberian police force in the medium term. And the One UN approach to recovery was effective in Liberia. It was a very well-integrated mission, and as I say, still issues remain in Liberia, but a remarkable peace from a very shaky start and a very checkered history. Some notable points. The Comprehensive Peace Accord was signed not only by the 3 warring parties, but again by 18 political parties in the country. And the ministries, uniquely in my experience, were divided 4 ways. So they basically said, how are we going to run the ministries during a transitional recovery period? And essentially, the 3 fighting forces each had a member in the ministries, plus 1 member of the civil society, which therefore meant that civil society actually assumed political roles in Liberia. Many NGOs signed and witnessed the CPA. It was very transparent. And some of the key ones there include the Mano River Women's Peace Network, WIPNET as I call the Women in Peace Network. We used to see them on the street every morning as we were driving past to our first meeting of the day, and they would wave at us, and we would be reminded that we're working for the people of Liberia by that. And they were an absolute joy to work with, and I instigated bringing them into every single one of my meetings on DDR as soon as we had commenced the program. Similarly, the Liberian Bar Association, for legal backing and for inclusivity of the intelligentsia, particularly in the lawmaking side. And so basically Liberia was a rare example of NGO participation in a peace process in political roles. And there are Women in Peace Network, absolutely wonderful, and they sat by the side of the road every morning, and they waved their banners and they waved to us, and it just concentrated the mind. And good on them. I brought in Indonesia here. Originally I was asked to talk about Africa. I could have gone on about Rwanda, Burundi, and some of the other countries that I've visited for short periods. But I decided to add in Indonesia, which is a country that I've worked in twice and greatly enjoyed, like the other ones. Essentially, I'm going to focus on the Aceh conflict in the northern tip of Sumatra Island. So DDR of 3,000 GAM, that is the Free Aceh Movement GAM. And essentially they wanted to secede within the northern part of Sumatra. And so basically 3,000 of their ex-combatants went through disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, and 2,035 amnestied prisoners. So there's an amnesty for the prisoners as well. And similarly, GAM activists who surrendered, people who may not have held a weapon, but who were supportive of that particular movement, were also included within that DDR program. In addition, 6,500 members of pro-government militias also enjoyed DDR. And so therefore we're not just looking at one side of the coin there. We're not just looking at people who happen to have held a weapon. We're looking at the whole picture in order to ensure that the mindset is given a chance to change. There were a lot of Indonesian forces in the area, and 32,000 were actually redeployed away from the area. And I was also involved very, very pleasurably in peace-building projects in Sulawesi, Malacca in the eastern part, and in West Timor. And also supported, and we'll see here, disaster risk reduction, DRR. It should say DDR on the second one, but disaster risk reduction are very much important in Indonesia because, in essence, although there were many other factors involved, the tsunami of December 2004 was the catalyst to end the fighting in Sumatra. Again, a beautiful country, which has had some problems. A little bit of the history of Indonesia, a very beautiful and very diverse country. But basically, to come to more modern days, the start of Indonesian independence was at the turn of the century, the last century. Finally, after the Japanese occupation and attempts by the Netherlands to reinstate themselves post-war, the Netherlands recognizes the independence in 1949. Other areas were incorporated. However, it was still unstable, being a large archipelago without very simple communications links between its extending islands. In 1968, General Suharto of the army replaced one of the founding fathers, President Sukarno, and basically during a period of 30 years led the country A popular man amongst some areas of Indonesia and less popular amongst others. And essentially that is linked to the earlier point raised by our Chinese colleague about the economic effect upon the change in government that is easily possible in many countries, but was very evident in the 1990s in Indonesia. East Timor again seceded after 25 years of occupation in 1999, and then there was the first ever direct presidential election. Now, independence was recognized by the Netherlands in 1949, and so therefore there's another 50 plus years before the first direct presidential election took place in Indonesia. December 2004, the tsunami ended the Aceh conflict, and there's occasional violence in Indonesia, but it is a generally stable and functioning state. Some of the potential lessons from Indonesia. After the elections in 2004, the first presidential elections, autonomy program was considered. It was very wise. It's a very diverse and large country, Indonesia. Spans many time zones, and it has, I can't remember how many languages, but I think it's easily 100 if I'm right. But essentially pulling together the different cultures and the different people spread through numerous islands across a wide area is never going to be simple, and therefore this was considered. The democratic processes were re-evaluated after the first presidential election, and indeed became more inclusive, again with the use of civil society and women's groups particularly. The successful one UN approach to recovery, and one of the points that I would like to highlight is the reinstigation of Musrenbang, which is a very clever system of bottom-up planning for development, which involves the grassroots in society in decision-making about how their communities are going to be developed. XGAM, the Free Aceh movement, very important lesson here. They reported at police stations during DDR. Very subtle, not overt, not embarrassing for anybody at all, and the police were developed in a way that they could actually make sure that it didn't inflame anybody's previous passions as regards that, and it was done without incident. And one of the other pluses from Aceh was that actually when women ex-combatants were to report, there were separate desks for them as well, so they didn't have to stand in a queue. They actually had the opportunity to report with some dignity and with some privacy. There's a one-year amnesty declared for the surrender of arms after the Comprehensive Peace Accord was signed. And importantly, the government of Indonesia ratified covenants on human rights, as listed there. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Court of Human Rights were agreed to, but they remain a little controversial in the country. Essentially, the government of Indonesia wished only to deal with matters in those courts that happened after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accord. And that may be Indonesia's solution to dealing with some of the questions regarding the past in Aceh. A quotation from His Excellency President Yudhoyono of Indonesia. And he's not looking at devolution, he's not looking at secession, he's basically looking at decentralization. It's about service to the people and building a relationship between the government and the people. And he said that to Parliament in 2005. This is Musrenbang, as I mentioned before, and it's a system that was a traditional system that was reinstated post-2004 within every community in the archipelago. And it basically means, and excuse me, my friends from Indonesia and other Bahasa Malaysia speakers and Indonesia speakers, but my understanding is that it means community discussion plus a development plan. And essentially it's a participatory budgeting process where residents discuss short-term issues facing their communities. So we're looking at the bottom up here, and it supports the most needy, and it's done in a consultative way. And it basically it aims to replace a centralized top-down decision-making in dishing out development funds. It also exists at city, district, regional level. It's consultative and inclusive development, and it gives the people a voice. And that's it in action. And it is a very, very enjoyable procedure to watch. highly consultative, and indeed everything has to be promulgated in the newspapers, the process, the participants, what they said, what was agreed, and the timetable to which they will operate. And indeed, central government must provide by law money for the process to take place in every single village. So on to Sri Lanka. It's a delight to be back. And I first came here in 2010, and I worked with some marvelous people, and I'd like to make mention of a few of them now. Major General Siddhanta Ranasinghe was my first counterpart. Major General Rajaguru was my second counterpart. And Brigadier Hetarachi, who I believe is studying in Jakarta at the moment, was my third counterpart, and I couldn't have wished for better. It was an honor, gentlemen, to serve with you, and as I say, if I can ever support your work in the future, I'd be delighted. So essentially, there were 11,664 ex-LTTE who had gone into the government rehabilitation program, of which I managed to secure funds to reintegrate 6,500, I believe, is the approximate figure. I'm not too sure of the exact number at the moment. So therefore, that leaves a large proportion, about 45%, still not reintegrated in the terms of the original agreement from the United Nations to complete this. Community peace-building projects initiated by Sri Lankans, by the government in general terms, but also by some members of the civil society and NGOs, and the international community were also implemented. And indeed, a few SSR initiatives were designed near the end of my tenure. I was also seconded to Africa and delighted to return to Kenya and to Somalia to advise governments on Al-Shabaab during my time here, and they were very interested in the Sri Lankan model. Sri Lanka is a very beautiful country as well, which has had its problems. A little bit of the history of my work in Sri Lanka. I'm not going to give you a history of the country. That would be too risky for me with the current audience. But indeed, when I first arrived here, I think that the project I was due to take over, which was called ICRS, Information Counselling and Referral Services, which is a method that the UN uses for reintegrating people socially, economically and politically back into society, and comes post the government's rehabilitation program. Essentially, I was asked, would I like to come here, because the program had somewhat failed from the United Nations side. And essentially, I was assured that there would be funds waiting for me, $10 million, that I should have access to all of the clients within the parks, it says there, protective accommodation and rehabilitation centres run by the government, and that basically Geneva was very supportive of any initiative I could come up with in order to move this project forward. I then moved to a unique welcome, and I always get a great welcome in Sri Lanka, but this was partially great. From the government side, I thank them again. They couldn't have been more accommodating. From the people's side, ditto. However, I must say on my second day, to be greeted at a United Nations meeting by being asked my first question within 2 minutes of being there. And my first question was this: Clive, are you going inside the parks? Are you actually going to go inside these government facilities and meet the Tamil Tigers face to face? And my answer is yes. The same as I've done in every other country. It's absolutely yes. And so the issue of access to those parks from the international community, which was a hot one, and it was one that I'd already foreseen when I was in Geneva, and I'd covered it by brokering and encouraging the Director General of my organization to speak to the Secretary General of the ICRC and agree that that would not be impinging upon anybody's human rights position. And that was a done deal. So before I got to the country, I'd headed that one up. And thereafter, the one UN approach to supporting anything to do with the XLTT in Sri Lanka did not happen. That left my project, which had started way before I got here, had failed once, in a position of fragility. And one of the tenets that I will touch on later about DDR and the lesson to be learned is if you start DDR, you finish it. It would be the same as if I was to invite half of this room on the left to join me for lunch and the other half to maybe find their own arrangements. It's never going to make a happy room or a position conducive for peace building. So ICRS, the reintegration of Tamil Tigers, was incomplete. Public awareness and reinsertion. Reinsertion is the time when people finish their demobilization and you put them back in the community. In Liberia, for example, when people left demobilization, they had $150 in their hands. They had a bed, a bag of rice, oil, salt, clothes, toothbrush, comb, soap. What you would need if you were going to come to a conference in Sri Lanka, perhaps. What you would bring with you so that you didn't arrive empty-handed. In Sri Lanka, the international community had ignored that. I know that the Commissioner General for Rehabilitation had started it with the limited funds that he had at his disposal, and it was something that we reinstigated into the program here, quite simply because that is not the way to complete a DDR program and to give people the right feeling going back to a community that may not be too welcoming to them. So public awareness and reinsertion were two big missing pillars of the program, and we did our very best to put something in place that would hold it together. We couldn't do what we did in Liberia. We couldn't, but we tried our very best, and we managed to give them something, at least to carry home with them during the reinsertion period. So ICRS was incomplete. I think there were several lobbies concerning, again, the United Nations involvement with the XLTTE that some people felt should not happen within the international community. And from my perspective, from a position of having assurances that I could complete this job here, and that was one of the reasons I took it, and one of the reasons I stayed on, I believe it was a missed opportunity by the international community to complete that job. A few lessons in general, just a few principles from the United Nations side. DDR is nationally owned. It's got to be transparent, inclusive. You must engage with it long term, and you must complete it. Reintegration is the important phase at the end of disarmament and demobilization. It has a social element, making sure people are accepted back into society, can function. Economic, making sure that they can support themselves and their families. And a political one, make sure they have a voice. Make sure, and indeed one of the initiatives, again through the two CGRs, was to make sure that people actually had national identity cards, which was absolutely fundamental. Without a national identity card in Sri Lanka, you won't travel, you won't open a bank account, and you won't be able to vote. And many of the people under the LTT rule simply would never have even heard of a national identity card. So that's the political reintegration as well. And again, all of these efforts are not sustainable without reconciliation between people and between communities and throughout the island. And reconciliation needs concerted peace building. That's not just today and a few words we say here in Colombo today. That's every day. And it's a whole nation process, so it's not up to us to do it. It's up to us to maybe stimulate others to do it, all of us. And so some lessons that I would derive personally from my experience in Sri Lanka would include engaging the UN Peacebuilding Commission. I believe there was only one grant that came to Sri Lanka from the UN Peacebuilding Fund in New York. Only one grant, and it was for demining very, very early on. However, once Sri Lanka is approved by the Peacebuilding Commission, it is therefore eligible for peacebuilding funds, and this has not been tapped by the international community. And I can't think of any more worthy country than the state that I look at, that Sri Lanka is in right now, to make best use of those funds. And I seriously encourage the international community to work with the government to tap into that particular area of support as they move towards peace building. Coordination of peace building efforts. There are plenty of well-meaning people here, international and local. But I don't think that it's coordinated well enough. I know that national bodies have been proposed for this, but some front towards this with a central message from government that's approved by the people, I think would very much galvanize wider peace building and thinking in terms of reconciliation within the country. Communities of practice. We talked about the other day about using social media. We talked about using the internet. Communities of practice amongst peace activists in Sri Lanka is a great way of spreading the right word. utilization of technology these days. And I'm sorry to a senior colonel from China, I do believe the next generation will be smarter than me, sir. But essentially the technology is there and they know how to use it, and I think that any efforts in reconciliation should make best use of that technology. Committees of the wise. It may well be within Sri Lankan society that there are people who can be ambassadors for peace, who are seen impartially by perhaps polarized sides of society. So tap into those if you possibly can. That's a lesson from the Congo. And there are local and regional reconciliation methods. There is a wealth of information sitting around this room today that can actually support Sri Lanka's thinking and let Sri Lanka come to its own decisions in the way it wants to go about local, national, and regional reconciliation. A couple of tips. One of them, the top one there, the issues from the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission did center on language, and I'm very pleased to have learned more about His Excellency President Rajapaksa's initiative to have a trilingual nation by the year 2020. And as part of that, one of the issues I think that is seen by the international community as a quick fix, a low-hanging fruit, one you don't have to climb too high from, is if we can ensure that language capability in police stations in the north fits the majority Tamil-speaking population there. Now, we can have sworn translators, and I knew some when I worked in Indonesia who actually did that job. So you have legally trained people who are bilingual, who can actually sit there and take the evidence in Tamil, make sure it's transcribed correctly, and make sure that the policing methods are therefore seen to be equitable, are therefore seen to be transparent. And that's an easy win. Similarly, I was very pleased to hear about the efforts concerning training in Tamil language for police officers, and spoke to the Provost Marshal yesterday on that, and indeed fast-track promotion for those who are bilingual. It may be an opportunity to stimulate the middle management to move a little bit quicker up the ladder if they do have that language capability. Again, from Indonesia, gender-appropriate police desks. When people do come in with a particular issue, let's make that policing a lot more friendly. And the more that's done there, as the transition from military presence to civilian rule of law in northern and eastern Sri Lanka continues, that would be an added bonus that would send the right message. Community policing, I think, has been looked at by the international community. And essentially, this is an area where, again, from the bottom up, if you ask the people what kind of policing they expect to have, what is workable, and you listen to them, you will have better engagement from the communities in terms of policing and rule of law in the longer term. Hotlines, we use these in Liberia where people can actually inform the police of potential problems within the community, gun ownership and so forth. And as I've mentioned before, public surveys. Whatever happens, the Musrembang system of bottom-up planning and consultative development, and particularly in rule of law, does work. Had the pleasure of meeting His Excellency Namal Rajapaksa also, who has the youth mandate for Sri Lanka on several occasions, and I think he is on the right track with some of the things that have happened. Twinning of schools, that was mentioned in LLRC as well. But mainstreaming peace studies in national schools curricula, this is something that was done in West Africa and some of the Francophone countries. And it was something that I had a small hand in a long time ago now. But it's a great methodology of making sure that there's 1 hour of peace studies per week. In a reconciling society, there's no way that you can possibly ignore the value of education to get your message across. Again, I've seen this already done in Sri Lanka, ethnically mixed sports galas, drama, poetry, and perhaps some awards for people who come up with the best peace song. Poetry, poster awards aimed at youth. And again, the possibility, if you have bilingual examinations, translation examinations for the two indigenous languages of Sri Lanka, it may well be an opportunity for the government to award students for best exam results. The media. Again, I say that the public information side of reconciliation has not really been used to its full yet in Sri Lanka, as far as I can see. And you can always do more, even in Liberia and in the DRC. But those two radio stations at the top, in Liberia, Okapi, in DRC, and Radio Unmil, were absolutely fundamental to maintaining peace and rule of law and order. Using diverse staff to present a unified message or unified front. We're doing that in this room today, but essentially that's something where you give your voice back to the people. Very clever in Africa with mobile cinema and using TV documentaries, and that is a true statistic. 22 countries, 40 local dialects, and that was a TV documentary all about conflict in Africa, taking a few case studies. It's fully 15 years ago now. I mentioned earlier in the week about workshops empowering bloggers in Arabia. And again, that's to stimulate democracy. That's not to undermine governments. That's to stimulate democracy and free speech. And above all, the last point is valid, that media support from the government to media to make sure it's engaged positively with the media will make sure that there is responsible reporting and that it's a partnership and people are not going off on the wrong message. The private sector is very strong in Sri Lanka, and that is unique to my experience of all of the countries I think that have worked in, except Indonesia. And essentially they can do very, very much if they are given the right government peace message and the right government messages on reconciliation, that they can actually instigate within their working practices equal opportunities, broadcasting peace messages, having peace posters up in the workplace, ensuring that there are bilingual kindergartens, that language training is there for middle managers to make sure that they move in the right direction. So basically a few principles of peace building as I wrap up. Local ownership is absolutely essential. It's not to be imposed. It's got to be a local solution because that's the culture with which it will work. Make sure it's inclusive. I've mentioned a lot about civil society today, about the people, Mushrembang, bottom-up planning, consultative processes, because building trust is the important thing. And that's quotation from His Excellency President Yudhoyono from Indonesia about not devolution, but about involving the people and serving the people better, I think is very important in building trust. Long-term commitments, it's not going to be simple. This is going to be a long road here in Sri Lanka, and the sooner that it is addressed holistically, and the sooner that everybody becomes involved in the reconciliation message, I think the better for the process. And appropriate processes, it has to be Sri Lankan-led. However, lessons can be learned from other countries, which I hope we'll be able to support Sri Lanka with. I put this one in here. These are things that are not usually associated with military people. So these things, when people think military, they don't really think about these sentiments, to be honest with you. They don't in Britain anyway. People have often said to me, I didn't realize you were an ex-military officer. Well, I am, and I'm very proud of it. And some of these things here, as the basis for peace, if seen in people in uniform, whether civilian police, whether military, whether privates, whether admirals, whether generals, or whatever, these things go a long way to build trust. And without the trust, there'll not be the confidence to move towards reconciliation. Oops. Can anybody recognize that man? Sir. Nelson, thank you very much. Admiral Lord Nelson, a British sailor. So I'm going to conclude with two prayers and a wish. And he fought at the Battle of Trafalgar, lost his life, was fighting for his country. And that's his last prayer on the morning before going into battle, faced by quite a sight, the combined fleets of France and Spain. It's a long story, and if you like stories about the sea, not Pirates of the Caribbean, but if you like some real stories, then you might enjoy his life story. But a couple of things are important there. He's not just benefiting the United Kingdom, but for the benefit of Europe in general. So it's a regional mindset that he's got. Similarly, the second part, and this is his plea, humanity after victory. Humanity after victory. That's what a military man has to do. And that was his last prayer in 1805. And there's a second one, St Mungo. I don't know if anybody will have heard of St Mungo. I wasn't born in Glasgow in Scotland, but I lived most of my life there. And he is the saint of Glasgow, the biggest city in Scotland. And he basically established Christianity near the city in the 6th century. And there's a bit of a history about it. People say that he performed 4 miracles to do with a bird, a tree, a bell, and a fish. It's a long, long story, and some of it I don't really understand myself, but essentially they are used, those 4 symbols are used in the coat of arms for the city of Glasgow, which is a marvelous city. It's always had to fight to prove itself. It's always had difficult economic times. It's always had difficult social situations, but it's a city with great spirit and a city with great character. And his prayer, way back in the 6th century, was, "Lord, let Glasgow flourish." And those 3 words have been adopted into the coat of arms with the bird, the tree, the bell, and the fish. And it's my adopted city. And you see those symbols all round the city. That's on a lamppost outside St Mungo's Cathedral in Glasgow. You see the bird with a ring in its mouth, and it's a long story, so I'm not going to go there, with the bell, the bird, and the tree. And that's the coat of arms, and at the bottom, you'll see his prayer. Let Glasgow flourish. And there's St Mungo, bird, tree, bell, fish. And so I'm going to finish with a wish. And there's only one wish, and it's for all of us, and our part to play in this country's future, and it's quite simple. And I really hope that that is what we can do in this country.